Karl Faase is with us today, reminding us that the most underreported global phenomenon is the explosion of the church and faith in Jesus Christ. Now, we don't hear that from the media. We hear about the rise of the new atheism, and Richard Dawkins is cashing in, as well as Sam Dennis and so many others. You come along and put together a video curriculum, that is right on the very cutting edge. Tell us who you are, why you did it.
Jerry, I'm a pastor out of Sydney in Australia. I run a Baptist church in Sydney, in suburban Sydney. It was actually watching Richard Dawkins on Australian television where he's just that kind of, he just exudes arrogance that nobody of any rational thought could believe any of this from a Christian faith perspective. And I tend to yell at the telly a little now and then. That happened a bit that night, but I was also a bit motivated to say, there's got to be a way of responding to this. And in Australia, I do a reasonable amount of media. And so I thought, well, we need to find a way to respond to what Dawkins is saying rationally, thoughtfully, but in an accessible format. And so that's why we developed this series, Towards Belief, to help respond to what he's saying.
Now, you brought in a whole team of experts. Just give us the litany of who they are.
Well, we actually interviewed 31 leaders across the world, from people like John Lennox, Richard Swinburne, John Polkinghorne out of the UK, Erwin McManus here in the US. In Australia, there's a number of people like John Dixon, Greg Clark. Now, I haven't put doctor in front of all their names, but we had about a third of the people we spoke to had PhDs.
Yeah, you need a thermometer to list all those degrees. But anyhow, before we throw to the first clip, we do want to just say that Richard Dawkins loves to, God delusion was his repudiation of theology. He's not a theologian.
No.
And this is where he banks on the ignorance of most people in his theological conclusions, and where I find your kit absolutely timely. Let's go to the first clip, and then I'm going to ask you some pertinent questions about it. Take a look at this.
There's a new book out about showing research showing that the ways in which the church in this country is now growing. One of the ways is in London. In the Anglican Church, the numbers on the electoral roll in the Anglican Church in the Diocese of London has gone up 70% since 1996. So this is growth that is happening. People think the church is declining, but it's not. When you look at it overall, there are places where there is remarkable growth taking place. And there are a lot of young people. That's what I notice here. Just this spiritual hunger amongst young people who are outside the church. We started our Alpha course last Wednesday. 1,000 people turned up on the first night of Alpha. These average age is 27. These are the majority of the people outside of the church, wouldn't call themselves Christians, but they are spiritually hungry.
Looking and studying, I read that North India had the largest group of people who had never heard the name of Jesus. And that morning, I happened to read Paul's ambition. He says, my ambition is to preach Christ to those who never heard it before. And then further study and research identified North India had more poor people than 26 African countries put together.
How many churches have you planted, or churches that you're connected with, that are doing these sorts of programs?
Now, so far we have reached 9,700 churches, and we have 4,200 full-time workers that are working with us. And all of that is focused in the northern part of India, which is the most unreached region in the entire world.
The church worldwide is exploding. You take, say, where I was born in China, nothing to do with me. It is the epicenter, north central China, of the fastest growth of the Christian church in 2,000 years. So I'm an Anglican. In Nigeria, there are 20 million Anglican Christians. The church is exploding in sub-Saharan Africa.
More and more we're becoming a global church with a local expression. So we have senior pastors, Brian and Bobby Houston, and they are the pastors of Hillsong Church globally. And then at each of our different locations, we have what is a lead pastor role. And that role is to run the day-to-day ministry of the church in that location. We have 36 services across a weekend at Hillsong Church in Australia. Pastor Bobby always says Hillsong Church is a home with many rooms.
So 20 years ago, I began the journey of pastoring this little church. And out of that church, I really started Mosaic. I took a Sunday night moment and we started taking out all the stacked chairs and bringing sofas and love seats and television cameras, and we created an internal world inside of this building. We built sets, and we would change what part of the world our sets kind of communicated, and I built a mobile stage, and we started moving it around the auditorium. We did a lot of pretty ridiculous stuff. The internet was just coming into existence, so we would go online and download images while I was speaking, and we started using theater and improv and film. And again, this was before it was real common, and so it was a pretty heretical, I think, application of faith. And it was really just trying to find interesting, provocative, engaging ways of communicating truth to people. I felt the greatest tragedy would be to take the most important message in the world and make it boring and irrelevant to people. And Mosaic now is probably a community of 50+ nationalities, maybe more, 60, 70, we don't really count anymore. Average age is probably around 25, 26 years old, about 70, 75% singles. And it has a high skew of people who would identify themselves as artisans and creatives.
In your role here at HTB, what are you seeing in the influence that your church is having in this community?
Well, we're just a local church, and what we're seeking to do is to provide a family. And the church is a home, and there are many pictures of the church in the New Testament. Well, one of them is it's a home, and we want people to walk in here and feel it's coming home. God is described in the Bible as being like a father who's looking to welcome his son, his daughter, back into the family. And we want people who walk in here to feel, I've come home. This is the family. This is where I feel at home. So this is what we're hoping people in this community will experience as they walk in through the doors of the church.
Give us a picture of what Rock Harbour Church is like.
Well, I think we're a contradiction in many ways because we're a very large church. In fact, over the last few years, we've had a time that's been pretty revolutionary because we've gone from one location in one city here in this warehouse to now 5 different communities across the county in 5 different cities. But even before that, you know, as a big church of thousands of people, I think one of the things that's unique is we like to be very attentive to what God's doing now. And there really is a sense, even in a big church, of a family on mission together, of movement, of celebration, of more than just a great sermon or worship set, but what God's doing in lives, what God's doing in schools, what God's doing in neighborhoods.
Karl, much to the surprise of the modern media, there's a global phenomenon that is like a freight train out of control, and it's the church.
It is, and that this program was really just trying to not discover that, but just point that out. I mean, there are places like China and Africa and even India that Josie Choco was talking about, and there's a bit of the kind of superior Western mindset that says, oh, well, that's those places, you know. What they've got to remember is that in places like London and New York, there are churches that are exploding in those cities, and there's a real significant change. And while it's totally unreported, the church is growing. And
I know for first person that charismatic renewal has literally exploded in the United Kingdom. And we see the Anglican community that God is resuscitating all kinds of life into. But how about China? I mean, here is the largest population of any nation on earth, is the largest communist country in the world, China. And missionologists say 100 to 200 million people?
Yeah, which is a most remarkable story, because in the 1950s, all foreign Christian leaders were thrown out of the country, and the country was basically closed for 20 years. And you know the story. As people came back, they thought, what will they find? Well, what they found was an exploding church. And who knows what impact that will have across the globe.
And in the United States, as an American, I can speak that usually our religion editors of all the networks and all the newspapers identify with the traditional denomination that is in total decline. What they don't know is that there are non-denominational, interdenominational, or independent churches that have just exploded. The bureaucracy of denominationalism, many of these cutting-edge, innovative church planners have just said, I want to go reach the needs of people. What did the experts say that was the strongest takeaway from this segment?
Look, I think that one of the last people we saw was Todd Proctor, who was a guy from Orange County in the United States, kind of heartland of American church. And he said he learned a lot out of England. And one of the things he learned out of England was this whole idea of white-hot faith, totally committed to make a difference in the community. I mean, the other thing he learned was kind of that in England they were seeking to find new ways to connect with the community and to connect with people of faith rather than just keep doing what they've been doing for years. And I think when you think about the sort of denominational churches, the more traditional churches, some of which are still doing great work, but it's that whole idea that nothing's changed. You know, if I went in the 1950s, 1980s, or 2000, it's going to be the same. Now, some people really like that, but not a lot. It's the ones that have found new ways to speak the eternal truths of the gospel that have made the difference.
And generational, cultural. Isaac Watts leaned over to his father when they were just singing the Psalms and had the daring to say we could write some hymns, and that was innovative. I mean, we see this proliferate generation by generation. As you look from Australia, we have the idea that Australia is in decline. It's not in decline. I mean, the Hillsong movement's wrapping its arms around the world, plus others.
Yes, I mean, and the church has been in decline in Australia for a long time, but there is a sense of plateauing out on that decline. There's a sense of the churches are starting to grow again. It's a tough nation. It's a tough space to talk about the things of God. It's a tough place to talk about belief in Jesus and life change. But in the midst of that, in fact, some of us believe that the new atheists are actually one of the best things that's happened.
Sure.
Because it's that whole idea: if they're right, we're wrong. If we're right, they're wrong. And you've actually got a kind of place of a meeting of minds. It's like, okay, let's work out what may be true. We've just come out of a period of time called postmodernity, as you know, which was who knows what's true, you know, whatever's true. That's kind of hard to speak into because there's nothing to push up against, as it were. Whereas now there's this sort of defining line, and it actually helps us in communicating into that culture.
So you've created this DVD series that went off on our e-store, Toward Beliefs, and it has 10 of the most crucial topics.
Yeah.
If you would just tease us, we're going to be doing this all week. What are we going to be talking about tomorrow?
Well, we're going to talk about the Bible tomorrow, which is just such a crucial and foundational kind of concept. What we tried to do was to work out, you know, what are the top blockers? What are the top things that block people from faith? And while we don't have time, we actually did research in Australia. We researched Australians and came up with the 10 top blockers. Now, we didn't do exactly the 10, but we know that these are the things that where people are saying, you know, I'm not so sure about this, but that concept or that idea or that thing that the church is doing, that blocks me completely. And what we're seeking to do in this is to diffuse the belief blockers of our time.
And just before we close, I mean, you're a pastor. You got behind and left the pastoral desk and said, we got to look at the world. What was the motivation? Because I know a lot of leaders all over the world and a lot of lay people are going to want to get this.
Partly it's because I am a pastor. I work in a local church. Sure. I'm desperate for resources. So I guess you can go out and find them, or you can go out and make them. So because I've been in the media and I've been involved in media, we decided that we ought to make this, and we ought to make it the best that we can.
Well, you certainly have brought some great leaders. It's entitled Toward Belief. You're going to find some of the brightest thinkers globally who are going to give you insight with Pastor Karl. And tomorrow we're going to talk about the Bible. Remember, this is available on our e-store. So go and get this resource. I guarantee you it will sharpen not only your pastor and leaders, but you as a believer as we pray for the world. Until tomorrow.